and welcome to episode 1 of Present Teacher by Things Education. In this podcast, we are going to talk about cutting edge ideas that are happening in education, and we are going to do it in a way that is accessible to all educators and hopefully directly implementable in your classrooms. I am Aniruddh, and I'm going to be your host for this podcast. And today we have Ritu, and we are going to talk about lesson planning. Hi, Ritu.
I am.
So, planning lessons for the classroom. Why is it crucial? Why is it important? I mean, teachers are experienced. They know they have been working with students for 10 years, 15 years. Why do they need to plan for lessons?
Okay, so I think that's a really good place to start. A lot of teachers have a lot of experience over many years, and general assumption is that if I have a lot of experience, I don't really need to plan my lessons because I know what to do. Um, and I think while that's a logical assumption to make, the point is that we have very little time with our students. We have about 35 minutes. Some bit of it is spent in administrative tasks, some bit of it is spent in classroom management. And lesson planning becomes important then because we as teachers need to make sure that we really know where we want our students to reach by the end of that lesson, what they need to do, what pitfalls we need to be aware of. And all of these things we need to think about before we walk into our classroom and not while the class is going on. That's what the whole point of lesson planning is.
Right. So, what I hear you saying is that there's a lot of preparation that needs to happen before I enter the class as a teacher because of limited time and whatever else, other things taking up time, even in that limited time. This reminds me of this book. I really like the title of the book, which says that Never Work Harder Than Your Students by Robin Jackson, I think. So, have you heard of it? I mean,
Yeah, that's a really interesting book. I was actually reading it recently, and one of the things that really hits me hard when I think about that book or go back to that book is that currently lesson planning is something that teachers all across the country do. It's almost a mandatory part of your responsibilities as a teacher. But what it's become now is uh, something that you do to check off a box in your to-do list. It's almost an administrative task that isn't really helping in the classroom. And something that the book explains to us really well is that the amount of work that you have to put in before and after class in order to make sure that your students are learning well, that they're reaching the learning outcomes that you have in mind, is immense. Even though the name of the book is Don't Work Harder Than Your Students or Never Work Harder Than Your Students, that's not what it actually means. It means that there is a lot of work going into planning before and after class.
I would say that, I mean, technically the title is right, where they're saying that, don't work harder than the students inside the classroom. But before that and after that, I think you need to be, and if you do that work before and after of planning, etc., then you actually don't need to work that hard during the class. And the students are doing the hard work of learning and you are facilitating it for them, is what I understand. But I mean, I really like this point that you made, and I think it might have gotten lost. So I'm just trying to underline that you said a lesson planning becomes an administrative task, which it just struck me, and I'm like, in this world of a lot of learning management systems and all of this, it's almost like thinking, we have a learning management system. We need to fill it in with these things that what is my plan going to be on this date, this date, this day. And I mean, is that what you mean when you say that it's an administrative task more than an academic task? Is I think what you were comparing it with, right? When you say administrative task.
Right. And I'm not discounting the importance of that, or I'm not discounting the fact that there may be many teachers who put in a lot of thought into that part of it as well. But what it's ended up becoming in a lot of schools is just a bunch of words that you put in without really thinking about whether students are going to reach their learning outcome or not. And that isn't the spirit of lesson planning.
Right. And do you recommend planning lessons every year? Like if I've done it once for one set of students, why do I need to keep doing it every year? If I'm teaching the
Mm,
same subject or the same grades or things like that.
right. It helps. The experience definitely helps, and the process of lesson planning becomes easier. You learn more about what works, what doesn't work. But you still have to plan every year for every lesson because your students change. The kind of students you're dealing with changes. Maybe sometimes the requirements of the syllabus changes. Maybe current affairs affect what you want to talk about in the classroom. So context keeps changing. Uh, and I'm saying this regardless of the kind of subject you're teaching, whether you're teaching social sciences or maths. Uh, Current affairs do affect what you're doing in the classroom. So you definitely should plan every year, though it gets easier.
Okay, great. Um, Interesting that we've spoken for I don't know what a few minutes now, and I haven't asked you this question yet. That what is a lesson plan? What is lesson planning?
Ah, okay. So that's a pretty broad question, but I think if I have to boil it down to a sentence or so, lesson planning is basically coming up with a plan of what you are going to do in the classroom, what your students are going to be doing in the classroom, what you want your students to think about during those 35 minutes, and finally, where you want them to get to in terms of their learning by the end of it.
Okay. I think I understand, but it's getting a little abstract. Can we specifically say something? I mean, can you help make this more concrete?
Okay. Um, so yeah, like I said, it's a very broad question and probably not the best answer. So let's take an analogy and try and think about one of my favorite analogies when I think about lesson planning is going on a trek. Um,
Like going on a
Going on a trek,
trek. Okay.
hiking up a mountain or hiking through a forested area. Um, so when you think about going on a trek, what's the first thing that you should plan for?
Where I'm going, I guess. Where I'm going is would be one thing that I would really want to know. What kind of snacks I'm going to take, what I'm going to do on the trek, what I'm going to see on the trek. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud now. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean, and what kind of snacks you're going to take, what kind of fun activities you do, they're super important, right? That's what make the trek worthwhile. But the first thing that you said intuitively was that you'd want to know where you're going. And without knowing where you're going, you really can't start planning anything. You want to know where your end point is, whether it's the fort at the top of a mountain or if it's a particular waterfall in the middle of the forest. You need to know where you're going. Um,
So your origins of being from Pune comes out when with your analogies that you go to a fort at the top of a mountain. Yeah, okay, I get it. Okay.
yeah, or you go to a waterfall in the Western Ghats.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm going to ignore. Yeah, yeah. Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, the first thing you think about is where you're going. Where do you need to end up? Right? And that's the first step in lesson planning as well. If you think about your journey in the classroom as a trek, um, you need to know where you're ending up. You need to know where your students need to get to in terms of their learning. And those are the learning outcomes.
Okay. So you're saying that the goal or the destination is the learning outcome, and this analogy is a little. Yeah, I think I like the analogy in the sense that if I'm a teacher, I'm going to wonder that is a trek up the mountain to get to the fort more difficult or dealing with 35 students in the classroom for those 35 minutes? Interesting. Yeah, okay. Fair enough. I mean, I think the rigor and the arduousness of it are probably also pretty aligned. So, okay. I'm, I think this analogy will work. Okay. Okay, I want to know the learning outcomes, what I want the students to achieve by the end of this journey, which is that 35-minute lesson. Is that how I think about it? Okay. Okay. Um, okay, so I have that. And then what? Then I can start
So,
with some planning of activities, right? I mean, I want the snacks on the way or no, not yet.
Okay, so snacks are important and snacks are coming and we're very excited about it. But in order for those snacks to be useful and for us to plan when we're going to eat and what we're going to eat and what we're going to do, there are a few more steps to get there. So we know we kind of decide where we want our students to get to, and those are the learning outcomes. That's the first step always. I need to know where they're going. Um, so let's get back to the trek analogy to make this clearer. I know where I'm going, but after that, I also need to know where I'm starting from,
Okay.
right?
If I'm in a group, if I'm with a group of friends, some of us may need a little more help. Some of us may be quicker. Some of us may need more stops or this more energy to begin with.
In a group of friends, you may not always have the same starting point. So, is this analogy making sense in terms of what's the next step in lesson planning then? We know where we're going. What's the next step?
So I'm guessing that, again, saying that students are going to be at different levels when they start off in the lesson. Uh, and
Right.
we need to figure out what levels each of those students are at, um, so that we can help them take that journey in the best possible way.
Right. So different students will come in with different levels of prior knowledge, with different experiences. Some may know a little more about the topic, some may really struggle with even starting off with a new topic to get to the learning outcome. So figuring out where your students are at the beginning of the lesson is a good next step to take. And the way we do that is doing simple pre-lesson assessments. They can take different forms. They don't have to be tests. But we need to be able to assess where our students are starting from.
So what you told me is that I need to know where we are going, where we're going to end up,
Mhm.
or where we need to end up at least. And we
Yeah,
need to know where each of us in the group is starting. Um,
yeah.
so why is this more important than, say, planning the actual activities of a lesson in the beginning? I mean, why are these things, why are these things supposed to be done or before the activity itself, the planning of the
Right.
activity?
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I get your question. I remember a time when we observed a lesson. And I'm taking an example to be able to answer your question, so I'll get to answering your question. We observed a lesson by a biology teacher, and if I remember correctly, she was taking a lesson on taxonomy. That's classifying plants, animals, organisms into categories, into groups based on certain biological rules. And you know
Classification.
this better than I do, so
Yeah, what you're saying is classification and taxonomy. Okay, fine.
right.
So basically
Um,
grouping organisms based on their characters, I'm guessing, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, so that's what the lesson was about. And I think any biology teacher or any science teacher will be able to attest that that's not a very easy topic to teach in terms of making it fun. It can be a fairly dry topic,
Right.
right? And teachers are worried about whenever we've spoken to teachers, some topics always come up as worry points for them because they don't really they really struggle to make those topics interesting for students, and it ends up being a difficult experience for everyone. Taxonomy and classification being one of them. So this teacher wanted to really solve that problem for her students and make it interesting. So in this lesson that we observed, she did a really fun activity. She did an activity where students were they were engaged, they were having fun, they were having conversations, they were doing hands-on activities. So overall, a very high energy classroom, right? And by the end of it, the teacher was happy, the students were happy, everyone felt this really deep sense of accomplishment that we did a topic that was tough, that was dry, and we did it in a fun way, and we're always going to remember this experience. And I think that's the crux of it, that they felt that they're always going to remember this. Um, but a few days later, when the teacher assessed them on that topic is when she realized that students didn't really understand the concept at all. Their learning levels were not where they should have been. And I think that's the crux of it, that you can have a really fun, engaging experience in the classroom, and remember that experience for very long, but you may not really understand or remember the concepts that you were supposed to learn during that class.
So
Right.
isn't that the experience or whatever, because it was so new or it was a novel thing that they did the experience kind of detract from the learning outcomes here, or the experience was just not connected to the learning outcomes, or the connections were not made apparent, or it could be any of these things. I don't know.
It could have been any of those things in different situations. I think in this situation, it didn't detract from the learning outcome, it just didn't make the connections clear. You can have fun, engaging experiences in the classroom, hands-on activities, lots of conversations. And as long as they're connected to the learning outcome and they're actually learning, leading to learning, it's fine. But if the activity is just fun and it's not really connected to what you're supposed to learn, the focus is on kids being engaged but not kids learning, that's where uh, that's where the problem sort of crops up. That experiential learning leaves out the learning part of it. So to answer your question, uh, yes, snacks and activities on a trek are fun. But if you're not going to reach your destination by the end of it because you got so lost in your snacks and your activities, then do not reach where you wanted to. You had fun along the way, though.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, in this example also, maybe even if the teacher didn't lose sight of the learning outcomes explicitly, it was not made clear to the students that, hey, this is how it's related to what we are trying to learn. So effectively, the learning outcomes, the sight on learning outcomes was lost. Like the focus
Yeah.
was not on learning outcomes, at least for the students who are trying to get there. Um, Interesting. So, okay, okay, now I am convinced. Fine, we'll not talk. I will not ask you about fun activities and snacks stuff for some time now. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to your analogy. We know where we are going, which is learning outcomes. We know where we starting, where each of us is starting from when we're starting a trek, which is doing some sort of a pre-lesson assessment, which helps the teacher gauge as to learning levels, experiences, etc., value system also sometimes of each of the students. Okay, so there we are. Uh, what is the next step going to be? And before we talk about the next step, we're going to take a short break here and be back in some time.
Hi, we have developed an amazing tool to help teachers plan their lessons, TEPS, or Things Education's pedagogical strategies. TEPS helps teachers by reducing the time that they spend on planning lessons. TEPS also helps you if you want to try a different pedagogical approach to teaching. So, if you want to know how to teach a topic in a project-based or inquiry-based or even constructivist learning approach, TEPS is for you. TEPS helps even seasoned teachers with fresh ideas on how to teach specific topics. So, scan the QR code on the screen or visit teps.school and join a community of empowered educators. Great teaching begins with TEPS.
Hi, and welcome back. So we were just talking about lesson planning with Ritu, and she's been using an analogy of a trek and how we need to know where we need to end up, which are the learning outcomes while you're planning for a lesson, and we need to know where each student is starting from, which is basically understanding where each student is before we start the lesson. And now we're going to talk about what happens next. I am trying to plan a lesson. I know where the students need to end up. I know where they're starting from. Now what?
Right. So I know you're really excited about the snacks and the activities, but we have one more step before that. So let's go back to the trek. We've started off. We're on the way. Uh, is that enough? Do we just keep walking? how do we know we're getting to the right place? How do we know we're getting to that fort or to that waterfall that we need to get to?
I am hoping that there are some signboards put up which says Sindhudurg Fort here or whatever. Sindhudurg is not even a fort or a mountain, so what am I even saying? Anyway. But yeah, some kind of I'm going to say milestones or directions or something. I don't know what to call them, but yeah, signboards.
Right. So signboards or milestones probably. We know that on the way we have to cross this big tree and then this particular rock or this particular stop point, rest point on the way. So we either have a map with us telling us what all these landmarks are, or we know it in some other way. But that's how we know we're on the right track, right? To get to where we are, to get to where we want to be. And without that, we're going to get lost. So what is that then in a lesson?
So basically breaking down my journey of learning into specific milestones.
Mm.
Is that what we are saying?
Breaking down my journey into specific milestones is one thing that I do as a teacher, but then I need to know whether my students are reaching and passing those milestones, right? I may want them to go in a particular direction towards a particular learning outcome. And maybe because of some misconception or maybe just distractions or lack of prior knowledge, they may be on a completely different path. They may be going towards an incorrect understanding or a learning outcome that they're not ready for right now. So while I as a teacher need to have those milestones in mind, how do I make sure that I figure out that my students are passing those milestones, are on their way to those milestones? What do we do there?
So you're saying we need to have some kind of assessments or some kind of checks, right?
Right.
Again, the teacher in me is coming out when I'm saying these things, assessments, checks, all that. Yeah.
Right. And those are terms that we're familiar with, right? We either have checks for understanding, which are our milestones. Are my students on the right path? Are they passing the right milestones? Are they getting to the learning outcome that I want them to? So those are checks for understanding, or what we also call formative assessments. Basically, to figure out how much my students have understood all the way to that learning outcome. And these are not assessments to figure out my students' level or to judge them or to give them a grade. That's formative assessments or checks for understanding are for me as a teacher to figure out if I am implementing or facilitating this lesson in a way that my students are on the right track. And if they're not, then what do I need to do to get them back on the right track?
Right. So as I hear it, you're saying that formative assessments not only help me as a teacher to figure out whether the students are on the right track or not, it also gives me feedback as a teacher whether my methods or whatever I'm trying to do is actually working or not.
Right.
So I can also change things based on the feedback that I'm getting. I can be open about the fact that, okay, it's not working for the students. Let me try something different. Let me try a different approach or whatever. Right? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. But can you give me some examples of how we can do this very quickly in the classroom? Because the most common way of me doing it, me experiencing it as a student is a teacher asking, have you understood? And just the loudness of the chorus of answers of yes or no would tell teachers in school that, okay, yeah, it has been understood or not. So can you give us some examples of doing it better than this? I guess I don't know. And
Right.
understanding that the practicalities of time and all of that, which are constraints as well.
Right. So have you understood is very often and very commonly used as a check for understanding. We're always going to get a yes because no student is going to want to be maybe the odd one out, or sometimes students are just not brave enough to say that I really haven't understood. So that's definitely not a good way of checking for understanding. One example that comes to mind is cold calling. You call out a student, ask them a question, uh, based on that milestone that you've decided, which is in your lesson plan. Ask them a question, ask a few different students the same question to see if they're able to give you the right answer. That's cold calling, where you are calling out students without really giving them the option of saying no to you. Uh, Let me explain that better. If you ask a question, very often the students who will answer you are the ones who are probably the most confident or who are at the highest learning level, and that is not a good. You're not going to get a good sense of whether all your students have understood. So when you cold call, you ask students that you know are of different learning levels, and if all of them or most of them are able to answer you, you know that you're on the right track. That's one way of asking. Another quick way of doing it is if all your students have, say, a small whiteboard or even a piece of paper, you don't have to have any fancy equipment, and you ask them a question and all of them have to quickly write down a one-word answer, a two-word answer, or maybe a short phrase, and then hold it up. You're able to quickly look around and see if most of them or all of them have been able to give you the right answer. Mm, And that's a quick check for understanding. So yeah, those are two ways that are coming to mind.
No,
Have
that's
you
a
experienced any other?
no. I'm sure there are multiple ways of doing it. I just wanted to have some concrete idea of how we can do this quickly. Um, so, but I think there's a crucial difference between the two methods that you just mentioned. Cold calling, you probably can't do it for 100% of the students. You probably just won't have the time. But the other one that you said that, just have a board or piece of paper where students just write down that word or phrase and they hold it up, you can kind of then get a sense of the entire class that, okay, okay, 80% of them are getting it or 80% are not getting it. So I should do something different. Okay.
Yeah.
So I need to have some kind of formative assessments to make sure that the lesson is going on track. And to use your analogy now, that we are on the way to the fold we are all aspiring to get to. Okay. So now um, I know how to get there. I know what are the things that I'm going to encounter when I'm there. Now I get why we haven't planned for snacks, etc. till now. Because now I think all of this information now tells me that, okay, given where we are going, given these are the things that we are going to experience on the way, I think I can plan better for the snacks and the activities, etc. Now. But please tell me now, at least we're talking about that, right?
Right. So now is when we can actually plan the snacks and activities. Like you said, now that we know the milestones, we know the checkpoints that we have on the way, we can plan out an appropriate activity. We can plan out a set of mini activities to push students along, and the resources and the kind of discussion questions that we want to use to just push them along in their learning. So yeah, planning out the activity, while probably is the most fun part of lesson planning and also the most fun part of the lesson for students, is the last step that you take. Is definitely not the first step, because without knowing where you're going, without knowing your checkpoints, where you're starting from, uh, planning an activity is it's futile.
Yeah. Like the example that you took with the classification and taxonomy topic in
Right.
biology. Right.
Right. So that learning outcome could actually have done with a more discussion-based approach, something that is facilitated more actively by the teacher rather than letting students do an activity all on their own. Mm, But that's a discussion for a different conversation, I guess.
Right. No, so okay, I get what you're saying that okay, there are ways to get students engaged and get them engaged meaningfully so that learning also happens. And that is what the activities and the whatever the core part of the lesson should focus on. But we're not getting into that in today's conversation, and we might do it a little bit later. Yeah, that makes sense. So to make a good lesson, what I understand steps are: one, no learning outcomes; two, no student levels; three, know the milestones, or know the milestones and prepare checks for understanding whether the milestones are being met or the students are getting there. and then finally plan the meat of the activities that are going to be done. And yeah, so is that how one should go about in planning their lessons?
Right. So it's a good checklist to have these 4 points. If teachers have these four points in mind while they're creating a lesson plan, this is a really good sequence to follow. Because you know your goal, you know you're getting there. And really, I mean, while it is the most fun to plan the activities, um, you may be completely off track at times if you don't know where your learning outcome is, or what your learning outcome is, where your students are going.
Completely off track, you're saying? Or on track?
Activities may be completely off track.
Off. Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes if you don't know where your students are starting from, um, your activity may not be at the right level for them. Maybe at the right level for some students, may not be at the right level for some students. Of course, teachers know their students really, really well, and while they're lesson planning, if you're keeping all this in mind, it just makes it easier to plan the right activities, plan the right resources, make sure that they're getting to where they have to get to by the end of it. So yeah, I would say this as a quick checklist to write down, to follow, is going to make lesson planning a lot easier and a lot more effective finally.
Okay, that's useful. And I mean, of course, there are, for example, there are multiple aspects to even learning outcomes as to how do I write down a good learning outcome? How do I make it focused, measurable, blah, blah, blah. Then even when you're thinking of assessments, how do I make that right question? I mean, you were giving examples of cold calling and some whiteboard putting up thing. Again, I need to have the right question, and I need to know that I've made a correct question in the right way. I've phrased it properly. I'm going to get the answer that I'm looking for. Um, and similarly with the activities, right? I mean, I can make an engaging activity, or I can make an engaging activity which is directly linked to the learning outcome, like we've been talking about. And how do we do that? What is engaging? Is just doing with hands engaging, or is there something more to it? And finally, when we talk about something like check for understanding, what is understanding? Um, are we as educators even understanding what understanding is properly? And these are still open questions that we haven't spoken about in today's thing. The good news is that we are going to talk about it in the coming weeks. So yeah, I think this was great, and great talking to you. I think this is a great first episode of Present Teacher. Um, and yeah, anyone who has any thoughts, please share them in the comments. If you like the video, like it. That'll help us a lot. Subscribe to our channel. It is important that you do these things. We're trying to keep these videos and this channel accessible for free as long as possible, in the spirit of what we do. So yeah, we'll see you in a few days with another episode of Present Teacher. Till then, on behalf of Things Education, I'm Aniruddh signing off. See you.